to our seventh class. I can't believe we are already at class number 7. This is our second to last class, and today we are going to be talking a lot about the events that took place in the 1700s, but also the 1800s. And then for our last class, next week, we will look at events taking place in the 1900s, specifically America's involvement in 3 major wars, that being World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. So, yes, it's good to see everybody here today. And yes, today we will be discussing the Industrial Revolution and the Civil War, the American Civil War, to be more specific. So I'm actually going to share my screen with everyone. And I'm going to, does anybody have any questions about last week's unit, which was Unit 5, or America's Beginnings? Does anyone have any questions about that unit or this worksheet? And if not, we will get started with today's lecture. And if you ever have any questions about any of the material we have gone over throughout these last 7 weeks, please don't hesitate to reach out. It's important stuff that you understand what happened historically and the effects that came from some of these from all of these historical events. So we will go ahead and get started. And so today we again are going over Unit 6, which is the Industrial Revolution and the American Civil War. Both of these events would help shape the future of America through technological, social, and governmental innovations. So today we'll explore the Industrial Revolution and its impact on world history, as well as the 19th century developments in America, such as the Civil War, the American Civil War. And so let's go ahead and get started. So the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution refers to the greatly increased output of machine-made goods that began in England around the middle 1700s. So the Industrial Revolution gets started in England, and as we talked about before, we have had intellectual revolutions, that being through the Renaissance and then through the scientific revolution. And now we're going to start seeing an industrial revolution, which is more of a technology revolution. And this is really going to be the first look at this new technology that we still use today that has impacted our society greatly, as these large cities have been able to grow through inventions and ideologies that came through from the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution would be one of the most influential periods in world history. And before the Industrial Revolution, people would woe textiles or cloth by hand. Then machines, but then after the Industrial Revolution, machines started to do this for them. It started to started to make different types of clothing and many different other things. And then people thought, oh, well, machines, they're going to help us with textiles. Why can't it help us with transportation or farming? And this is where there was this huge just technology boom that came from this. So as said before, the Industrial Revolution began in England, and this began when wealthy landowners began buying up land and improving farming methods. And this led to an agricultural revolution that tied into the Industrial Revolution. So after these wealthy landowners would buy up the land of village farmers, they would enclose their land with fencing or hedges. And the increase in these wealthy landowners' land holdings enabled them to cultivate larger fields. And within these larger fields, there were enclosures. These landowners experimented with more productive seeding and harvesting methods to boost crop yields. So again, Industrial Revolution, um, it really helped to influence how many people can be fed in a given time, because you had these wealthy landowners buying up all this land and using new inventions on the fields to increase production. And so this enclosure movement had two important results. First, landowners tried new agricultural methods, and two, large landowners forced small farmers to become tenant farmers, um, and tenant farmers meaning they would have to give up their farming and move to cities. And people moving to cities, to these urban centers, was another large impact of the Industrial Revolution because it helped to transform these cities into very populous and diverse centers for work. So the process of crop rotation proved to be one of the best developments of scientific farmers, as this process improved upon older methods of crop rotation, such as the medieval three-field system. So the Industrial Revolution began in England because of a large populations of workers, an extensive amount of natural resources, and an expanding economy to support industrialization. So industrialization, which is an important term for the Industrial Revolution, industrialization is the process of developing the machine production of goods, and these machines require resources. So, for instance, natural resources that were fundamental for industrialization included water power and coal to fuel the new machines, just like how to run a car, whether that be a combustion engine, you need fuel or oil, or an electric car, you need electric power. In order for these machines to work properly, you need that fuel, you need that electricity. Similar situation here. Iron ore would be made to construct the machines, tools, and buildings. Rivers were needed for inland transportation, quicker transportation, and harbors were needed so merchant ships could set sail in in an efficient manner. So, as mentioned earlier, England's expanding economy also supported industrialization, as business people invested in the manufacturing of new inventions. And these um, the highly developed banking and other systems in England, just business systems, also would contribute to this industrialization. So, you have people that, these business people that want industrialization to happen so they can make money. You also have this banking system that wants to make money from industrialization. So these factors also contributed to Britain's industrialization. People were encouraged by the availability of bank loans to invest in new machinery and expand their operations. So you would see people buying these bank loans in order to start their own business or to start or invent their own machine, their own product. And growing overseas trade, economic prosperity, and a climate of progress would also lead to an increased demand in goods, or for goods. So, materialism, people wanting what they wanted, people wanting that piece of clothing or that new machine or that new farming tool. This led to growing overseas trade, economic prosperity, and just progress all in all throughout the world. And the British Parliament also passed laws to help encourage and protect business ventures. Um, and so in England, the Industrial Revolution began in England, but other countries would also start to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution. Someone says industry needs capital, including money, resources, and laborers, and that is true. I mean, for a industry to grow, you need to have innovation. You need obviously workers, but you need money, and you need a good product. This is for any industry to grow, and that is a good point. This was happening a lot during the Industrial Revolution. People, business owners, entrepreneurs were figuring out that, hey, if I can get a good product, get people to work on it, and then make it grow, then this could get me a lot of money. And that we will talk about in a little bit. So other countries had advantages during the Industrial Revolution, but Britain had all of the factors of production, or the resources needed to produce goods and services that the Industrial Revolution required. So Britain had land, labor, and wealth. And then this individual also states that law for equal, a comment that had just come in through the chat, law for equal competition and motivation to invention. And yeah, that's actually more of a newer ideology too. So we just talked about how all these factors contribute to innovation and progression with inventions, but laws also need to be put into place um, to regulate these businesses and these wealthy entrepreneurs and business owners. So good comment. Thank you. So
Sorry,
go ahead.
Henry, I have a question.
Yes.
I was wondering, was unemployment an issue during the Industrial Revolution? Because now that there are new inventions and new machines, so did people lose their jobs because they were replaced by machines?
Yes. So this I have heard and read about. I don't know I don't know a clear and specific answer, but yes. Um, the people had lost would lose their jobs because innovation was taking place, and people were finding quicker and more efficient and effective ways to get the job done. So yes, people lost jobs, and people would have to move because of this, or land was taken over by people, and yes, this did occur, and so and then we have another. When we talk about Industrial Revolution, it seems to focus on the big history and the good points it brought without discussing its dark sides. For example, in the Dickens Oliver Twist, it vividly described the bitterness of the common people and abuses of capitalists. Correct. This we will get to in a little bit. We won't touch on it too specifically, but yes, certainly the Oliver Twist is a perfect example. This book is about how people would just they were kind of crumbling under the Industrial Revolution, and there was a lot of poverty, and people could not get meals, and there was crime because of this poverty. So yes, there were, like with anything in history, there are dark sides and there are good points and bad points. So that is a good comment, and certainly something to remember when viewing anything using the historical perspective. Does anybody have any other questions on that first slide? And if not, we will move on to the second slide. So inventions that came from industrialization. So the Industrial Revolution actually started with the textile industry. And this is when inventions in the late 1700s transformed manufacturing of cloth. So the demand for clothing in Britain had greatly increased as a result of the population boom caused by the agricultural revolution. And progress in the textile industry would actually spur other industrial improvements. And the first development was that of the steam engine, which came from the search for a cheap and convenient source of power. So in 1765, a mathematical instrument maker by the name of James Watt actually figured out a way to make the steam engine work faster and more efficiently while burning less fuel. So that's the innovation piece. You have a product already, but how do we build upon it, make it better, make it more efficient and more effective? And this is exactly what James Watt would do. It was also discovered that the steam could propel boats. So in 1807, James Watt's first steamboat, called the Clermont, would set sail for its first successful trip. And British roads would would also improve. So right now we're really focusing. See, it starts with this textile industry, and then we move immediately to transportation. People wanted to have better transportation on roads and on water, land and water. So on water with the steam engine, or the steamboat, steam engine would be like a locomotive, but roads would also improve. And these roads would be improved. So the roads, we go to like the concrete roads. This was an invention that what industries would not area. And roads were actually started by the Romans, and then they had this improvement over the years. It really came in the industrialization when these roads would see kind of a full-scale innovation, and they would be innovated through as they would now be layered with large stones and a smooth layer of crushed rocks to improve the overall quality of the roads. So people can now drive over these roads. They would not, when it rained, they would not crumble. They were now a lot stronger. And I just saw a comment in the chat. Industries would not be constrained by a river area. Correct. Well, now, especially now, because you would have um, more innovation, transportation, or better transportation on these rivers. So, um, yeah, I mean, the rivers have always been, any form of water has always been essential um, for 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 trade and improvement in industry. So, good point there. Um, so really the steam-driven machinery powered by these English factories in the 1700s um, was huge. I mean, you had steam on water that were propelling these ships, but a steam engine on wheels, also known as the railroad locomotive, would drive the English industry after 1820. So we're seeing the start of the Industrial Revolution primarily being the steamboat, but now we're seeing the steam locomotive, which was huge because we're finding more innovative ways to travel on land. And the invention and perfection of the locomotive um, had at least four major effects. So, first effect, railroads spurred industrial growth by giving manufacturers a cheap way to transport materials and finished products. So it was, obviously huge for industry. I mean, people could transport quicker, and but people could transport their materials quicker through this, and it was less expensive than putting all of your resources or materials needed for industry on a ship and then having it sail across a river. Here you just put it on the train goes, delivers it in an efficient way. And the railroad boom also created hundreds of thousands of new jobs for both railroad workers and miners. And this is because obviously to build railroads and to build the locomotive, you needed a lot of workers, and this took a lot of time, a lot of hard work. So this created, yes, hundreds of thousands of jobs. Yes, it was Mr. Watt who invented the um, steam engine. I believe the steam. Yes, yes, he was at least the guy that made it. James Watt had made it. Um, Made the steam engine, innovated it, made it more efficient and effective. So yes, can kind of be seen as more like the father of the steam engine. Another effect of the invention of the locomotive was that railroads boosted England's agricultural and fishing industries. And yes, these railroads do innovate industries for obvious reasons, just quicker transportation and creation of jobs and the just the overall boom of economy. And then fourth, these locomotives made travel easier, and they encouraged country people, so people living on farms, to take distant city jobs because it was quick and easy transportation to the cities. So now let's focus on the Industrial Revolution in America. But first, does anybody have any questions?
I have one question. So I
Yes.
just noticed that the Industrial Revolution in the UK and the American Revolution, they happened at about the same time in the 1700s.
Hmm.
So did the war between the US and the UK kind of slow down the process of Industrial Revolution? Did it have any impact on the Industrial Revolution?
Can you state your question one more time? And you don't have to go into as much detail if you do not want to. Just um, if you could please ask your question one more time.
So the Industrial Revolution in the UK and
Hmm.
the American Revolution is the war between the US and the UK.
Hmm. Oh, yes, yes,
Is
yes.
because these two events they kind of happened at about the same time, around in 1700s.
Okay. Hmm.
So I'm just wondering if the war between the US and the UK kind of slowed down the process of industrial revolution, or
Oh,
did it, or maybe it didn't had any impact on the industrial revolution.
mhm. That is a good question. I you definitely had some effects of the um, um, American Revolutionary War for England, but because England again was going through industrial revolution, but also a war during this time. So yes, I believe there was some impacts. May have been some slowing down, but then you also look at but America, because their industrial revolution would not begin really until the 1820s, the war wouldn't have much effect on America. The war didn't have like much effect on America. But we'll talk about in just a second how the War of 1812 had between England and America. That war did have effects on an industrial revolution on both sides. Now I'm liking these comments. Did that answer your question, by the way?
Yes, thank you.
But you're welcome. Yes, and if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to ask. So, how come the industrial? Fred asks, how come the Industrial Revolution did not start in the Europe mainland? I mean, at least by the mainland. And again, we're going back to the resources that Britain had and the laborers, and just the Parliament of the British Parliament that did support Industrial Revolution and passed laws that that supported and really pushed the Industrial Revolution. England had a lot of woody areas, so a lot of trees and just land in general to help with the Industrial Revolution. And this is, I guess, just the mindset. And if we're looking at England during this time, it is one of the most powerful. It is the most powerful country in the world too. So it just had some of these essential factors, which included large populations of workers, extensive amounts of natural resources, primarily found in forests, and expanding economies, a defined banking system, and laws passed by the British Parliament to push industrial revolution. That made England the primary place for the Industrial Revolution. So I hope that answers your question. Um, and that is a good question. You know, you would think why would the Industrial Revolution not start in Germany or France? And also some of these countries on the European mainland were going through their own issues during this time. They were going through internal issues. They were having internal issues with separation and of states and harsh treatment of citizens. So Europe just as Fred just pointed out, England was the most powerful country. Um, so I will now share my screen again, so we can see. Here we go. So we will now discuss the Industrial Revolution in America. But before, here is a steamboat, and these are still seen today. Um, they're actually quite cool to go on, and yeah. And then here is a railroad locomotive, the train, and yeah. So both of these were the key inventions during the Industrial Revolution, especially regarding transportation. Without these, we would not have gotten to the car or the space shuttle, or at least it would have taken a lot more time and much more complex process. So the Industrial Revolution in America. Um, so the United States actually possessed the same resources that allowed Britain to mechanize its industries. America had these fast flowing rivers, rich deposits of coal and iron ore, and a supply of laborers made up of farm owners and immigrants. So they had similar um, and even identical uh, resources um, that Britain had. So during the War of 1812, Britain actually blockaded the United States, trying to keep it from engaging in international trade. And this blockade forced America to use its own resources to develop independent industries, which would manufacture the goods that the US could no longer import. So, as in Britain, industrialization in the United States began in the textile industry. Textiles led the way, but clothing manufacturing and shoemaking also underwent mechanization. especially in the Northeast. So if we're thinking Northeast, we are looking at New Hampshire and Maine and Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the key. Um, in the early, they experienced much industrial growth in the early 1800s. And the U.S. remained actually primarily agricultural until the Civil War ended in 1865. During the last 3 decades of the 1800s, the country also experienced a technological boom. Factors that contributed to this technological boom included three factors. One was the wealth of natural resources, such as coal, oil, and iron. The second factor being a burst of inventions, such as the electric light bulb and the telephone. And the third factor was a swelling or an increase in urban population that consumed the new manufactured goods. So, building large businesses like railroads required a great deal of money. So, to raise this money, business owners sold shares of stock or certain rights of ownership. This is where the stock market starts to develop and really get going. And now, obviously, the stock market controls so much business and industry in our world. And, we look at the stock market today, and you see, for example, businessmen, Tesla CEO and founder, or not founder, CEO, Tesla CEO and SpaceX CEO Elon Musk, he was worth, I think, around $50 billion before the current pandemic took place. But because his company Tesla went public or got on the stock market, he is now worth $180 billion. So the stock market has massive effects on any given business because it increases their value, but also on individual business owners and entrepreneurs and regular people because it increases their value. So that's just a side note on the how important the stock market is today and how it got its start back during the Industrial Revolution in America. So people who bought stock became part owners of businesses, and these businesses are called corporations. These corporations were able to raise the large amounts of capital or money needed to invest in industrial equipment. So in the late 1800s, large corporations such as Standard Oil, founded by John D. Rockefeller, and the Carnegie Steel Company, founded by Andrew Carnegie, sprang up. They sought to control every aspect of their own industries in order to make big profits. So actually scroll here, and this is just the next slide continued. So in the United States and elsewhere, workers earned low wages for laboring long hours, while stockholders earned high profits and corporate leaders would make fortunes. These business owners, such as John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, they were worth billions and billions and hundreds of billions of dollars, while their laborers or workers were making far too little and couldn't even support themselves. So the Industrial Revolution shifted the world balance of power and increased competition between industrialized nations and poverty in less developed nations. And industrialization also widened the wealth gap between the industrialized and non-industrialized countries, even while it strengthened their economic ties. So to keep factories running and workers fed, industrialized countries required a steady supply of raw materials from less developed lands. So in turn, industrialized countries viewed poor countries as markets for their manufactured products. And this mentality too um, is not very good, because when we look at these poor countries as just ways of extracting resources, we don't look at the people, the citizens of these countries who are suffering because of this. So, unfortunately, during this time period, greed was definitely intertwined in society. Um, and as the old saying goes, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. So, and I see something in the chat, and did the Industrial Revolution in America have something to do with the patent system? As I know your Constitution authorizes the Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts. So yes, the Industrial Revolution, excuse me, did have something to do with the patent system because you had these companies and these people, entrepreneurs, creating these machines, these inventions, and they certainly patented them. And under our Constitution, yes, you do have some protections with the patent. So, for instance, if I create a steam locomotive and I patent this and say this is how this works, it has to be very, very specific, though, and approved by many people. I patent this, I say this is my invention, I get it legally patented. Yet, if somebody else does the exact same thing to the very bolt on the steamboat, then they are not allowed to do that legally. They are not allowed to do that. Good question. So between 1700 and 1900, revolutions in agriculture, production, transportation, and communication changed the lives of people in Western Europe and the United States. Industrialization gave Europe tremendous economic power, yet the economies of Asia and Africa were still based on agriculture and small workshops. Industrialization also revolutionized every aspect of society from daily life to life expectancy rates. Despite the hardships, early urban workers also suffered. Um, Population, health, and wealth rose dramatically in all of these industrialized countries. And the last point, and probably one of the most important, that the industrialization would also lead to the development of a middle class. So, not the very rich, but not the very poor, but the middle class. And this created great opportunities for education and democratic participation. But greater democratic participation, in turn, would also fuel a powerful movement of social reform. And this ties into our next topic of social reform, but much more known as the American Civil War. Does anybody have any questions on that last slide? And if not, we will go right into that. But beforehand, here is a historical painting of the Industrial Revolution in America. Obviously, you have these harbors where you have the merchant boats and ships, and then you have these large factories with the steam um, coming out of the factories. And yeah, this is an accurate photo of what um, a city could have looked like during the Industrial Revolution. Um, and if you watch any like old films or new films, but where they're depicting what England or London looked like during the Industrial Revolution, you will probably see something similar to this. And then here on the right is Andrew Carnegie, who founded the Carnegie, um, as I he very very with Carnegie Steel Company, and they had many things to do with railroads. So he was very very wealthy as well. One of those business owners that made a lot of money. And yes, smog. This was something that scientists had figured out that yeah, these pollutants that are coming out, the steam that is coming out of these factories is terrible for the environment. And yeah, it had definitely factored and contributed to climate change that we are experiencing, unfortunately, today. So yeah, next we will move on to the American Civil War. Um, and before I see a, don't want to, I'm going to share my screen again. Um, so do you agree that higher industrialization will definitely lead to more democratic participation? When looking back to history, this seems to not be common. So yes, higher industrialization during this time definitely led to more democratic participation, and this is because again, um, you had you had more you had more democratic um, outlooks on things because people were not being treated really, but some people were not being treated. Many people were not being treated as they thought they should, but also um, you had this middle class now that could speak up for what they wanted, and this led to more democratic participation, um, and this directly led to social reform. So this kind of ties into these business owners that and businesses that are making so much money, yet you have workers and laborers that are not making much from this. Um, so we will now look at the Civil War and expansion in the United States during the 1800s. And during the 19th century, um, America sought to acquire more land. And this was started in 1803 when President Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France, which doubled the size of the United States. And in 1819, Spain gave up Florida to the United States. And then again in 1846, a treaty with Great Britain gave the U.S. part of the Oregon Territory, which is off to the west coast. And these land accusations, and then 1845, the U.S. would annex Texas. Um, and these land acquisitions stretched the U.S. from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. Many Americans during this time believed in manifest destiny, which is the idea that the United States or any country had the right and the duty to rule any given amount of land. So in this case, um, the United States, people believed that the United States had the right and the duty to rule North America from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. For example, American government leaders used manifest destiny to justify evicting Native Americans from their homelands. And this was very sad. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 made such actions official policy, where they are taking these people out of their homelands, forcing them out of these homelands in a very sad manner. And it enabled the federal government to force Native Americans living in the East to move all the way out west, in a very sad and disappointing part of American history. And as mentioned earlier, the U.S. would also annex Texas in 1845, continuing this westward expansion. And America's westward expansion raised questions about what laws and customs should be followed in the West. And since America's early days, the northern and southern parts of the United States had followed different ways of life. The North, for instance, had a diversified economy with both farms and industry, and it developed and developed on free workers. However, in the South, um, the South would base their economy on a few cash crops, primarily cotton, and this relied heavily on slave labor. So these economic differences between the two regions led to a conflict over slavery, as many of these Northerners viewed slavery as wrong, but many Southerners believed that slavery was necessary to their economy. And this was a complete um, misconception. Um, the economic, it, you know, the South really did think that, hey, slaves are our only way of making our economy strong because they can work on these tasks and on these farms and plantations. And this was just wrong on the Southerners' part. And this disagreement over slavery actually fueled a debate about the rights of the individual states against those of the federal government. So, like, in America's mind, they're thinking, okay, we're expanding to the West, but how should the Western states be led? Should they be led with a Northern mind or a Southern mind ideology? And this definitely brought some disagreement that would really pick up after Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Southerners opposed Lincoln because Lincoln had promised to stop the spread of slavery. And so, one by one, Southern states began to secede or withdraw from the Union, and they would join together as the Confederate States of America. And so it would be the Union or the Northerners versus the Confederates or the Southerners. And this would be the Civil War, which was fought from 1861 to 1865. And although the South or the Confederates had a superior military, the North had a larger population, better transportation, greater resources, and more factories. And all of these factors contributed to the North winning the war in 1865 after the South had surrendered. So in 1863, Abraham Lincoln, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in the Confederate States were now free. And in the aftermath of the war, the U.S. Congress would pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery in the United States. And then the 14th and 15th Amendments would also be added, and they extended the rights of citizenship to all Americans and guaranteed former slaves the right to vote. And so these were huge and innovative steps for America during this time that and we would start to see hopes of equality in the United States. So from 1865 to 1877, so right after the American Civil War, Union troops would actually occupy southern states and enforced constitutional protections, and this led to a period called Reconstruction. And Reconstruction in America is right after the American Civil War, 1865, and then that goes on to like the later 1870s. And unfortunately, when these federal troops left the South, white Southerners started passing laws that limited African Americans' rights, and it became difficult for African Americans to vote. And these laws encouraged segregation or separation of African Americans and whites in the South, and this led to many disappointing events in America. But the civil rights movement would ultimately um, grant African Americans rights throughout the United States. And so for our last class next Sunday, we will actually discuss America's involvement in three major world wars, as I mentioned earlier. But before we end, this is a historical uh, picture, or not picture, but sketch of the American Civil War. And here is President Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, or America's 16th president. And yes, he is known as one of the best presidents in American history for his involvement in um, and huge influence in taking down slavery here in the States. And that is it for this class. Thank you um, very much. Does anybody have any questions over this lecture?
And Emery, I have some question. Do you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think the Civil War in Chinese we translated to the war of North and South.
Oh,
There were not no definition about civil. I think civil is the concept is
mm,
very different from America to Taiwan. I think is that means civilization or citizen. Can you explain about that? Thank you.
of course. And is there any way that you can actually just type your, or say your, ask your question again, or just type it in the chat? I apologize. I'm just having some trouble, volume difficulties on my end. Oh, civil means. Yes. So, well, thank you, Fred, very much. So civilization or citizen. So civil here, that is a good question. I don't know the exact meaning of civil in the context of the Civil War. Um, we could view it as a civil thing, like a civil. When we're thinking civil, we're thinking kind of a I don't know, a pact or an agreement, but at the same time, there was much disagreement between the North and the South. So that I don't know on the top of my head what civil means in the context of the Civil War, um, but civil could mean within the country, and I believe, yes, I believe that is actually the from what I had actually heard this before, the correct interpretation of civil um, in the context of the Civil War within the country. Yes, you had divide in the country. I mean, America had just fought the American Civil War in violation to peace. Yes. Um, civil in this context, I don't think means like agreement or positive, but more divide and violation with the violation of peace within the own country, within one's own country. Which is sad because very, very sad whenever that happens, whenever there's a civil war. For instance, in Africa, there are multiple civil wars that have gone on over the last century. And yes, this is civil, meaning within the country. Thank you for yes, Fred, thank you for refreshing my memory. I apologize for not knowing that right on the top of my head, but I must have forgotten. So yes, does anybody have any other questions? And if not, I'm going to actually share my screen just one last time to go over the homework or the assignment for this week. And this is Unit 6 worksheet. So we had civil wars in the 1940s. Yes, I don't know too much about those, but I am under the I do understand that yes, there were civil wars that had transpired, um, and this in China in the 1940s. And didn't these civil wars lead to then the creation of the people's I don't know the official title of China today, but what China's government is known as today. Yes, people. Yes, yes. Thank you, Fred. People's Republic of China. Yeah. Um, so there are four questions for this worksheet. And first, in your opinion, which invention created during the Industrial Revolution had the greatest impact on world history? You can list and explain any of the inventions that we talked about in the lecture, or you can research some of the inventions and um, uh, and then pick one that you thought had the greatest impact. Second, what were the four factors that contributed to industrialization in Britain? This is in the lecture slides. And third question, what was the primary debate that contributed to the start of the American Civil War? And then our last question, name the three amendments to the American Constitution that were added to the American that were added after the American Civil War, and briefly describe them. Just one to two sentences each. Um, so yes, that is the conclusion for this uh, this week's lecture. Thank you all very much, and I'm going to end the recording now.